Imagine this scenario. You're driving home alone along a remote highway. No one else is around, but you notice a bright light following you. It makes strange movements unlike anything you've ever seen before. Unsure of what it is and feeling a little unnerved, you keep driving until it appears directly over the road in front of you. You make a sharp turn down a secluded road to get away from this thing, and that's when you see a number of beings, figures, whatever you want to call them, standing on the road. This is the beginning of the bizarre story of Betty and Barney Hill. Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today I'm doing a bit of a deep dive into paranormal activity, so to speak, specifically this UFO abduction story. The Hills were a couple married in the 60s. Barney was a postal worker and Betty was a social worker, and they were both involved in politics and activism as well. On the way home from their delayed honeymoon, a year after their wedding, they claimed to have been abducted by aliens, and 4 years later, they were thrust into the spotlight once newspapers got a hold of their story. Although I have no personal experience with UFOs, I've been fascinated by the subject, I think, my entire life. Initially, I was drawn to the Hill story after learning that it was the first published account of an actual abduction. And 60 years later, it still remains a significant part of UFO folklore. There was even a short virtual reality movie made about it called Dinner Party, which I'll link in the description below if you're interested. It's kind of hectic, but worth the watch. But as you can imagine, it's been widely criticized, and there's not a whole lot of tangible evidence. But I think I've found just enough to keep my mind open to the possibility that this was real, and I'd like to share that with you as we go through the story of what happened during and after the abduction. Missing time. The first point being 2 hours of time they couldn't account for during their trip back from their honeymoon. So the story starts on September 19th, 1961, when they were heading back from Niagara Falls. They had stopped for coffee at a diner somewhere in Vermont around 10 p.m. and they estimated they should be home at 3 in the morning. While they were driving, Betty noticed a strange light in the sky that at first she thought was a falling star or a satellite, and then it started making erratic zigzag movements, and she realized it couldn't be either of those things. They pulled over a couple of times to get a better look. Barney told himself it must be a small plane or something, but it was too far away to really see anything until they reached an area in New Hampshire called Indian Head, and the lights stopped over the highway directly in front of them. Barney pulled the car over, grabbed some binoculars, and this time he was able to get a really good view. He described seeing a cigar-shaped craft about 80 feet or 24 meters long, and through one of the windows, a number of human-like beings staring back at him. He ran back to the car, completely terrified that he and his wife were going to be captured by whatever this was, and they took off driving, and the craft, of course, followed them. So they turned off onto a smaller road to try to lose it. At the same time, their car started making a weird buzzing sound, and they encountered a roadblock, which they eventually got through, and the next thing they remember was being 35 miles or 50 kilometers down the highway, feeling a bit drowsy, but they just continued driving home. Once they got home, they noticed the sun was coming up, which they weren't expecting, because it was actually 5 a.m., 2 hours later than they had anticipated, and they had no understanding of where that time went. It wasn't until a few years later, under hypnosis, that they would remember what happened during that time. Broken items. When they arrived home, they also noticed a few of their items were damaged or dirty, which is the next point of evidence for their case. The straps on Barney's binoculars were snapped. His new shoes were badly scuffed. Both of their watches had stopped and couldn't be restarted. Betty's earrings were missing and her dress was torn. It was a new dress and she hadn't worn it for very long, so she put it back into the closet, and a pink powder formed on certain areas of the dress, which could just be mold, but that would indicate there was some kind of a moisture. And underneath the powder were these unexplained marks and stains. It didn't happen to Barney's outfit from that night, but his had been cleaned since then. And Betty held on to that dress for decades and eventually had it tested in a lab, which basically concluded that the stains were not sweat or urine, and they would have come from an external source because they were more prevalent on the outside of the dress rather than on the inner lining. And also the outside of their car had a number of small marks appear about the size of a small coin, where the paint looked very polished. Now, Barney wasn't very keen on speaking about what had happened the night before. They were an interracial couple, and as an activist, he thought it would just destroy their credibility if word got out that they were claiming to have seen a flying saucer, as they were called back in that time. But Betty wanted someone to talk to, so she initially confided in her sister Janet, and Janet spoke to her neighbor, who was a physicist, and they recommended that Betty do some tests on her car where the small marks had appeared. So she took a compass, and when she put it up to the small marks, the dial started spinning, whereas it wouldn't react to the other undamaged areas of the car as you would expect. So at this point, even if you're skeptical that they were abducted by aliens, it would seem that something still did really happen to cause damage to these items, and also for them to lose that significant amount of time on the road. Even considering the few times that they pulled over to get a better look at the light that was following them, those stops were not more than a few minutes long and would have added maybe 15-20 minutes to their trip. Caught on radar. To further support their claim that they really had seen an object in the sky, a UFO researcher and author Jacques Vallée claimed in his book Dimensions that something was detected by the New Hampshire military radar in the early hours of the morning Betty and Barney were traveling. The following days and months. In the days following their sighting, Betty was experiencing nightmares, and Barney was tormented by a feeling he described as one of a person who saw something he doesn't want to remember. Betty was so shaken that she reported it to the Air Force, who phoned the Hills several times to discuss the details, and eventually reported it to Project Blue Book, who are the UFO investigations part of the Air Force. And their conclusions were really odd. They said the Hills had not seen a UFO that night. Instead, what they saw were actually lights used to advertise a party event. I don't know, it wasn't quite clear. But it doesn't make any sense when you consider the Hills' description of what they initially thought was a star, and how that is nothing like a beam of light that you might see swirling around in the sky. And it wasn't as if Betty had had a 2-minute chat with the Air Force and they just decided that the Hills were mistaken or crazy. I believe they had about 3 separate phone calls that were quite extensive over a few days. I don't think this is an argument for or against the Hills story, but it's so glaringly odd that it makes me wonder what were the intentions of the Air Force and specifically Project Blue Book. Were they gaslighting the Hills, or was it just that they were working off the limited information that Betty and Barney could remember at that time? They were interviewed by other authorities on the subject as well, but no one was really giving them any answers. And Barney's health was suffering despite seeing doctors and Betty's attempts to do her own research. Hypnosis. Then about 2.5 years later, they were referred to a psychiatrist, Benjamin Simon, who was also an experienced hypnotist. He was apparently skeptical of UFOs, but considering Barney's health, he decided to at least try to treat them because he'd had success treating veterans with their symptoms of PTSD. It took about 6 months of weekly sessions. Sometimes Betty and Barney would be separated and sometimes together, and they gradually pieced together what had happened during those missing 2 hours of time. As you recall, they drove down a small road off the highway. Their car started making buzzing sounds, and they encountered the strange roadblock. And at this point, under hypnosis, they remembered seeing some beings standing on the road in front of them that kind of looked human, but more like the classic grey aliens that we're used to hearing about and seeing in images. And they approached Betty and Barney in the car, which was dead. Betty and Barney were terrified, but they fell into a trance-like state, meaning they were awake, but they had no control over themselves. The aliens removed them from the car. Betty was able to walk and went with them more willingly. But Barney's eyes were closed, so he was dragged, which would explain the scuffs on his shoes. During hypnosis, Betty referred to one of the beings as the leader, who was able to communicate with her in English. As they were taken on board the ship, he told her that they had nothing to fear and they meant no harm. Once on the ship, they were separated into different rooms, which resembled hospital operating rooms with an examination table, which they were laid upon. They both had to remove their clothes. One of the beings attempted to remove Betty's dress for her, but couldn't figure out the zipper, and they ripped it, trying to remove it. The aliens were very interested in their spines and seemed to count their vertebrae. They had samples taken of their skin, their fingernails, and their hair. The aliens were also really fascinated with their teeth, since Barney had dentures, which came out really easily compared to Betty, who had her real teeth. During Betty's exam, they performed what the leader described as a pregnancy test, where they inserted a large needle into her stomach, which was incredibly painful, until the leader hovered his hand just over Betty's face, and that took the pain away. After her exam, everyone left except Betty and the leader, and while they waited for Barney's exam to finish, they engaged in polite small talk. She asked the leader where he was from, but he said it would be too hard to explain without her understanding more about the universe. They also talked about their age, and the leader said they have no concept of age, time, or even death. She told the leader that no one would believe this had happened to her, and she asked if she could take some proof back home, and the leader agreed. She chose a book that had symbols and vertical lines in it, nothing that she could understand, but one of the unfriendly aliens took it off her before they left the ship. Barney remembers having a slightly different experience in that none of the aliens were communicating with him, and also they investigated around his genitals and gave him an anal probe, I suppose, whereas they didn't do that to Betty, at least not according to what she remembered. After both tests were finished, they were led back to their car and were informed by the leader that they most likely wouldn't remember anything that had happened. They got back in their car and continued their journey home. Their hypnosis is an interesting point of evidence for a couple of reasons. The first being obviously their detailed recount of being abducted, but also the strong emotional reactions they had under hypnosis, which their families said was not typical for either of them, and especially putting on a performance like that if it wasn't real. And while Betty had been more open to talking about it over the years, Barney had shied away from it. He was much more concerned with his reputation and credibility and not being seen as a crackpot. And yet, under hypnosis, he came up with these detailed memories years after the fact and had such emotional responses to them that at times they had to stop the sessions. It seems it would have been better for Barney had he not been abducted because he didn't want anything to do with it and he had nothing to gain from lying about it. They were doing quite well after they finished with the hypnosis sessions. They were mingling with a fairly prestigious political and social crowd, and it would have been another year or two before their story hit the press. Considering theirs was the first widely publicized story about abduction, they would have never seen anything like that before except in the movies. Now, psychologists say two things about people who claim to have been abducted. The first is that they really believe it happened to them, and the second being that they're not crazy people. So if they weren't lying for attention and they weren't crazy, why would they come up with a story like this? That's the question most people have and try to answer with some other explanation, some of which are fairly plausible, but none can be truly verified. So far, anyway. But despite the efforts of skeptics and the government to quash these UFO encounters, we really seem to be drawn to them anyway. The way they seem to defy our understanding of science and technology and common sense, it really brings a sense of mystery to life. I mean, you have to wonder how we can live in such a vast universe and there not be other intelligent life out there who would want to study us. If we just found a snail on Mars, or even the shell of a snail, it would make headlines around the world. So what do you guys think? Do you think they were lying, or have you heard a better explanation? And have you had any experiences? If you have and you feel like sharing, I would love to hear about it, and I'm sure others would too. Thanks a lot, guys, for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.